Myth Vision. Welcome back to Myth Vision Podcast. Your host, Derek Lambert, and we are going to have a debate today between two scholars on did Jesus exist, the historicity of Jesus Christ. I say Jesus Christ because I was a fundamentalist for many years, and it's almost his last name, if you will. And today I'm going to go ahead and just start introducing you guys. I think this is going to be a valuable debate for many people who watched the first one on Pine Creek Doug's show. This one, we're going to be switching things up a little bit. I hope that this is a different, more unique debate compared to what you're used to seeing. Both gentlemen have a lot of respect for each other, and we're going to end up going with positive remarks back and forth. But first, let me start with Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald. He earned his undergraduate degree from Bob Jones University, a Master of Divinity from McCormick Theological Seminary, and a PhD from Harvard University. He taught Christian origins at the Iliff School of Theology in Denver, Colorado, from 1980 to 1998. Since 1998 to 2015, he was the John Wesley Professor of New Testament at the Claremont School of Theology and Professor of Religion at the Claremont Graduate University. He also was the Director of the Institute for Antiquity and Christianity at Claremont. Make sure you guys go down in the description. He has books. You can check them out. It's always good to check his material out, especially his comparison on imitations with the Greeks and the epics that are there. I mean, fascinating material. So welcome to the show, Dr. MacDonald. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yes, sir. And we also have Dr. Richard Carrier, has a PhD in the history of philosophy from Columbia University and is a published philosopher and historian, specializing in contemporary philosophy of naturalism and in Greco-Roman philosophy, science, and religion, and the origins of Christianity. He blogs regularly, lectures for community groups worldwide, and teaches courses online. He's the author of many books, including Sense and Goodness Without God, On the Historicity of Jesus, and The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire, as well as chapters in several anthologies and articles in academic journals. For more about Dr. Richard Carrier, see his work at www.richardcarrier.info. Now, you guys go down in the description. The links are all there. Make sure you check his books out. He is a peer-reviewed on this subject in terms of the historicity of Jesus, which is a big thing to say. So both of these guys have a lot of weight, and they also have a lot that they want to say on the topic, and they're coming at completely different angles. So with that being said, let's start with a couple opening positive remarks about each other's works. And we'll start with you, Dennis, on this. And then when we go to do the debate, we'll have Dr. Carrier start with his proposition, and then you guys can follow up and have kind of a free discussion back and forth, asking questions and I guess poking into each other's views, because too often in debates that I've watched, the like structure and the concreteness of how things go don't allow the depth of, I guess, the communication to go in the areas that they could go. So with that being said, Dr. Carrier, what would you like to say about Dr. MacDonald's work? And Dr. MacDonald, what would you like to say about Dr. Carrier?
Well, okay. Dennis is particularly well known for the Homeric gospel thesis, right? That the gospels draw on Homer and other aspects of Greek literature. And I find the case pretty overwhelmingly good. And it's funny. There's one of the criticisms, there was an article in an academic journal criticizing my book on the historicity of Jesus. And they spent like a whole page arguing that the one reason I'm wrong is that I rely on Dennis MacDonald. And I'm like, hey, come on. I mean, two things. I mean, one, I didn't. My thesis does not depend on MacDonald's thesis, but I mentioned it positively because I think he's right about the way that literary tropes got used, the way that Homer gets transvalued. The one thing, like teaching me all of that as well, that's my introduction through MacDonald to Brodie, right? Thomas Brodie's work. And so like introduced me to all of that, introduced me to the concept of transvaluation and how to better understand how myth is constructed and for what purpose.
That's right.
And so I've learned tremendous amount. And a lot of that really did influence the way I constructed my argument on the historicity of Jesus. People won't necessarily see it because I might not like say it, but because his name's kind of anathema, like people get like focused on how dare you rely on MacDonald, but he's really good. What are you talking about? He's right on this stuff. I have not, however, read the Dionysian Gospel yet, so I haven't seen that thesis to evaluate it, but I'm kind of keen to get to that at some point.
Thank you.
Richard, good to see you again. Here we go.
Yeah.
The viewers may be wanting to know why you're dressed like a Caesar in the middle of winter.
I'm dressed more like Caesar's slave, actually. I've got the slave's cap and I've got the gray toga.
Right, I'll grant you that part. And but just so the viewers know that your heater went out, and you're quite, if I could put it this way, a Trojan for staying in there and with this debate. So anyway, good to have. I want people to know that in many respects, you and I are on the same team. Yeah. I have become an atheist, although I was a fundamentalist in my youth. I totally agree that Jesus went through a process of mythologizing. And I'm grateful that you have, in your work, identified places where traditional Christian arguments for the historicity of Jesus have been weak. So at that point, I think we're in agreement. I could make nice a little more than that. I want to know if you have a cat or a dog or a goldfish that are suffering the way you are today. But
no, I'm by myself, so we're good.
Okay, so maybe we should get right to the discussion. But anyway, good to see you again. And I do hope this is productive and at least amicable.
Yeah, of course. I expect it to be.
Yes. And both of you gentlemen carry yourselves that way. I really do appreciate you guys coming on to the show, Myth Vision, to make this debate possible, as well as those who are listening at home. I hope that you, for a moment, will try your best to, I guess, strip away whatever presuppositions you might have at the moment, consider the evidence, actually consider it, and see what makes the most sense to you. And you might come out at the end scratching your head going, wow, they both made great points. But I'm interested to hear what your conclusions are in the comment section after this video. So Dr. Carey, if you could start us off with the proposition for mythicism. I know there are various forms of mythicism out there, but yours being an academic one, you having credentials and PhD, I'm interested in hearing your proposition, and so is Dr. MacDonald. We can go from there.
Yeah, it's important to point out I'm not defending the weird crank conspiracy theory versions of mythicism that you find on the internet. And I often write about that too, the sort of how it makes it more difficult for me to be taken seriously is that there's these ridiculous versions of the theory. But I think if you take away all of their errors, all of their false claims and their illogic and all that stuff, there's still a little bit left that actually holds up. And that's what happened to me when I did my research on the historicity of Jesus, is that I found that actually there is a case left over that could survive peer review and did. So it's a case worth taking seriously, whether you agree with the conclusion or not. And that's the case that I'll summarize. I'll just basically go through a few points. It's really 3 points with a few examples for each one, that'll sort of set the stage for why I think it's worth doubting the historicity of Jesus. I'm not certain, of course. My conclusion on the historicity of Jesus is there's still a 1 in 3 chance, perhaps as much as that there was a historical Jesus. So I don't claim to be certain on the conclusion, but I do argue that I think there's reason for doubt. And the reason is what I'll outline here, and then we can get into the details probably as we continue the discussion. But for point 1 is that the earliest Christian literature, principally the letters of Paul, but not only that, only talk about Jesus as being seen or met in revelations from above. They never clearly place him in earth history. And so that's the first point that sort of sits there and makes us wonder. And for example, if you look at 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says we only know from the scriptures that Jesus became incarnate, was killed, was buried, and was resurrected. And then the first time anyone is said to have seen him is after his resurrection, which meant by revelation. So if you look at the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, there's no ministry, there's no appointing of disciples and so on. Likewise, in Romans 16, Paul just outright says that the gospel and teaching of Jesus were known only from scripture and revelation. He doesn't mention any other way of people knowing it. Paul also has no knowledge of Jesus picking disciples in his life. He knows nothing about there even being disciples. He only knows of apostles who he seems to think are people who received a revelation of Jesus. And you have even in Romans 10, Paul says that it seems to imply that no Jews heard Jesus preach, that only apostles did. And so only apostles could communicate those teachings to the Jews. and so on. We could give many more examples, but when the way Paul talks and the things that are missing from the letters and the way Paul mentions things in the letters suggests that Jesus was at that time only known as a revelatory being, not as an actual historical person who recently died and started a movement. Point two is that Jesus appears as a definite historical person only in highly mythological texts, namely the Gospels. I think Dennis would even agree that the Gospels are definitely mythologies in some sense, which really means, I think, really means one text. I think Mark, but even if it's not Mark, there's this one Gospel that started it all, and then it simply got rewritten and embellished later in other Gospels. It's just a myth that keeps getting redacted and expanded. And Mark is an unknown author, and even if we're talking about somebody other than Mark, it's even more unknown. An unknown author writing in a foreign language, in a foreign land, who cites no sources for any of his information, and whose compositional mode is unmistakably mythical. That's the key point there. And like I said, even if the original myth was a pre-Mark and Q-like document, the myth still appears to have been invented only once and then is simply rewritten, modified, and expanded over time. And that's it, because there are no other sources for a historical Jesus. For example, sources outside the Bible simply pick up teachings derived directly or indirectly from that repeatedly rewritten gospel myth. We can establish no corroborating source, in fact, for anything about Jesus in those gospels. All we have are the gospels, really. And when we look at this in context, a lot of mythical people in the ancient world, deities and heroes, some also met only in revelations, were also given elaborate biographies, placing them in history with stories, siblings, parents, obscure hometowns, and every similar thing. Anything you can find about Jesus, you can find similar things invented about other mythical people. And this includes lots of people, from Moses and Abraham to Romulus and Dionysus and countless others. So how do we know that Jesus isn't like those people inserted into history fictionally to represent associated teachings, right? So when we look at the evidence, and this is what I find, is that for every person whose historicity we are certain of, you could say Hannibal, Spartacus, Pontius Pilate, they either do not begin life as revelatory beings who are first given a history only in mythology, or we have clear evidence of their historicity, none of which evidence we have for Jesus. The evidence for Jesus just doesn't look similar to these other figures. So that's point two. Point three, the last point, is that every attempt to get around points one or two, I find, doesn't hold up logically or factually. And for example, the argument that Jesus must have really come from Nazareth because there is no other reason to attribute such an origin to him is, on the one hand, not logically valid, since many mythical people were given obscure towns to hail from. So that doesn't argue they didn't, or doesn't argue they existed, right? We can't really use that inference. But on the other hand, the premise is also factually false, because there are actually many good reasons that that specific town would have been contrived for a mythical messiah. And none of those reasons, I find, can be ruled out as unlikely. Even if we can't rule them in, we can't rule them out. And I think the last time we debated this question on the Pine Creek channel, which was also a really good discussion, by the way, I recommend people check that out. Dennis listed 8 other things about Jesus in the Gospels that he believes establish that Jesus was a real historical person, but not a single one of those things is attested in the letters of Paul. They appear first out of whole cloth only in the unsourced myths about Jesus. And some of those things, I think, Paul appears to even contradict. For instance, Paul never mentions anyone being a disciple. He only knows of apostles who received a revelation. He never mentions Jesus being baptized or ever being in Galilee or Judea or traveling with anyone or ever even encountering Jews or Romans, much less being killed by them. And not only does Paul never mention Jesus being a preacher or miracle worker or exorcist, but he even repeats a creed in Philippians 2 that says that Jesus surrendered all his supernatural power, becoming a slave essentially to the world order, which would suggest that he wasn't known as a miracle worker or an exorcist who had powers over demons at that time. And not only does Paul never mention Jesus being crucified by any earthly authority, in 1 Corinthians 2, Paul seems to say the opposite. He says the people who crucified Jesus knew about God's plan to use his crucifixion to end the power of death in the world, and thus would not have crucified him in order to keep that power of death in the world. And that's a motive and knowledge that only celestial demonic authorities had, not Romans or Jews. So it doesn't seem like Paul even comprehended the killers of Jesus as being mere Romans or Jews. And likewise, as I mentioned, in Romans 10 and 16, Paul appears to say no one ever met Jesus outside apostolic revelation. In Romans 13, Paul says the Roman and Jewish authorities would never act against God's will, whereas in 1 Corinthians 2, Paul says the entities who killed Jesus would have acted against God's will. So the evidence suggests that all 9 details, from Nazareth to being an exorcist or even being executed by Romans, were all part of the allegory and mythology that was woven for Jesus later. There's no evidence any of those details are actually true or precede the Gospels even. Even when Paul talks about the brothers of the Lord, for example, the only brothers of the Lord Paul explicitly tells us he knows about are baptized Christians, not biological kin. We have no evidence that he knew of any other kind, and so we can't just assume what he means here. And when Paul talks about Jesus being born of a woman and made of the seed of David, we have no evidence he meant either of those things literally, much less that any real parents were involved. To the contrary, the strange way, I think, that Paul says these things in their peculiar contexts make it likely he didn't mean either of those things. And it was only later Christians who tried to spin those verses that way to harmonize Paul with the gospel mythology. So that's point 3. And then conclusion, I would say those are the 3 reasons we should at least doubt Jesus really existed, or at least entertain the possibility that he didn't. The earliest sources only depict him as a revelatory being. The Gospels are the only primary sources placing Jesus in earth history, all other sources being derivative of the Gospels. Yet the Gospels are wholly mythical in construction. And there is no evidence that any detail about Jesus in the Gospels is any more likely historical than mythical. And I'd say that pretty much sums up my case. And then the rest is just devil in the details, I would say.
Awesome. So I'm going to free you guys up here, and Dr. MacDonald, I know you're going to want to respond and then also probe, and I'm going to allow you guys to go back and forth. And I'm just saying this on record on the show that if I have to butt in, it's simply to allow one person to speak. There is a delay in the connection between us and Dr. Carrier. So we got to try not to overlap each other as much as possible. At the same time, I really do want you guys to poke into each other's sides and see what you can uncover. And I know that the audience will learn. So thank you so much.
Richard, there's something I want you to elaborate before I give a response. I would like you to give then a recap of what you understood to have happened in the Pauline context of your what you call the revelatory Jesus.
Right.
And ask if you find any support for that view in Christian Gnostic texts.
Okay, so the gist, I think what you mean is where, if Paul didn't believe that Jesus had never heard of a Jesus being crucified on earth, where did he think Jesus was crucified? Very definitely, Paul thinks Jesus took on a body of human flesh, wore it like a bodysuit. It says this pretty much plainly in Philippians. And so that he could be mortal, so that he could be killed, and so that his death could atone for all the sins of Israel. And then he was exalted for this sacrifice and resurrected and returned to his exalted station deep in the heavens. So the question is, where then was he? Where did he become incarnate? Where did he die? And who killed him? And I find the most plausible, there are many possible things you could put in here, but the one that's most plausible, has the most support, would be the idea that it was Satan and his demonic agents in the firmament that did this. This is something that occurred in the firmament, and following the same model that we have for Osiris, where Plutarch says that the public teachings were that Osiris, like Jesus, was a historical pharaoh who actually walked the earth and did miracles and taught things and so on. But that the real teaching was that every year he descends below the moon and is killed by the Egyptian equivalent of Satan, resurrects, and it returns to heaven. And this cosmic thing goes on and over again. That's the way he's teaching it. And I think, in the Christian system, it only happens once, because once and for all, there's no need to repeat it every year. But it's a similar model. And we find this in the Ascension of Isaiah, or at least the earliest redaction we can reconstruct of the Ascension of Isaiah, that it appears to say that it was Satan and his demons that killed Jesus.
Okay, but who receives the revelation originally that you talk about this revealed Jesus? Is
Cephas,
that Paul?
Right? No, I mean, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, the first one to see Jesus ever is Cephas. And then the 12, and then the brethren had some sort of vision, and then the apostles, and then Paul last of all.
The other part of my question was if you found support for this view of the revelatory Jesus in Christian Gnostic texts, Nag Hammadi say.
Yeah, I don't look in those texts because I find them to be much too late to be useful. So I think no one has established that any other gospel we have predates the gospels that are in the canon. The closest we get is like the Ascension of Isaiah we can establish was originally written somewhere around the same time as the Gospels. Okay. And all the other Gospels we have seem to be derivative of the Gospels that are in the canon. So
I actually agree with that.
So I don't right. So I don't find any support that. I actually side with the Westar Institute's report now that they've concluded that Gnosticism is kind of a made-up category, that there really weren't such a thing as Gnostics. There were just different sects of Christianity with overlapping beliefs. But as to this particular thing, I haven't found any useful material outside the Bible, really, other than stuff in the 2nd century. Some of the church fathers I found useful.
But you do know this, that some of your critics have suggested that among early Christians who would be most congenial to your understanding of Jesus as a revelatory character are Christian Gnostics. And yet those Gnostics don't deny that Jesus was a historical person, but rather that and it's a bit like you said, Jesus takes on a human form and so on.
Yeah, but these are really late texts, though, right? So, like, we really can't establish any of this goes back even to the 2nd century, other than beyond speculation. So that's why I don't find it like these are offshoots. I find I find these as offshoots of the historicizing sect. I don't think we have any surviving mentions of the original sect, other than maybe the Ascension of Isaiah might preserve it. There might be hints of it indirectly. Ignatius seems to be arguing against Mythicists, from whom we have no texts. 2nd Peter also seems to be arguing against some sort of sect of Christians that deemed the gospel stories to be completely mythical.
That's right. Sure.
But we don't have any of these texts. We don't have their opponents, is what we're saying.
Okay, let's bracket that then. Are you familiar with the article by Joseph Hoffmann, Controversy, Mythicism, and the Historical Jesus?
That's a while ago, right? It's not a new
2012. Joseph. That's right.
Yes, I am. Yeah, I read that.
But I want to read some of his criticisms as a way of initiating my own and give you a chance to respond to what I consider one of the harshest versions of a criticism of your work. All right.
There's been much harsher than Hoffmann, but go on.
But then we'll back up. Now, the reason that Hoffmann's interesting is that he's not only a biblical and patristic scholar, but he's also an atheist. Mm-hmm. And he's interested in making a distinction between being an atheist and being a mythicist.
Yeah.
And would argue that there's no necessary connection between the two. And that's one of the things that I would hold.
Oh, I agree. I argue with this myself all the time.
Okay.
But go on.
So anyway, if we unhinge those two, then let's focus on mythicism. I'm going to read his comments, but these comments I actually agree with, and they rather set up, I think, the debate between us. Mm-hmm. It is my view, simply stated, that while facts concerning the Jesus of history were jeopardized from the start by a variety of salvation myths, by the credulity of early believers, by the historiographical tendencies of the era, and by the editorial tendencies of early writers, the Gospels retain a stubbornly historical view of Jesus, preserve reliable information about his life and teachings, and are not engulfed by any of the conditions under which they were composed. Jesus the Nazarene did not originate as a myth or story without historical coordinates, but as a teacher in first century Roman Palestine. The basic factuality of Jesus is undeniable unless we, 1, do not understand the complexity of the literature and its context, 2, are heavily influenced by conspiracy theories that are even more incredible than the story they're trying to debunk, or 3, are trying merely to be outrageous, which you've been accused of. The idea that Jesus never existed requires the concoction of a myth more incredible than anything to be found in the Bible. And then this part, methodologically, the mythicist vision disposes of anything contrary to its core premise. Jesus did not exist. And by the way, I think this part is unfair. In a quicksand of denial and half-cooked conspiracy theories that take skepticism and suspicion to a new low. The myth theory, in short, is a dogma in search of footnotes. And then this paragraph you're going to love. Perhaps the most odious example of polemic masquerading as scholarship is the work of a certain Richard Carrier, whose book is 400 pages of air-strewn nonsense. So I put that out there just so our viewers can see what kind of animus can be in this discussion. And how
I've heard similar animus towards you. Actually, I've heard similar animus towards your work. I'm familiar with it, but go on. Yeah, with which I disagree with the animus too. But
go ahead. And I told you I disagree with some of this, but I think it paints a larger canvas for this discussion. Instead of, our holding hands and singing Kumbaya and making nice. So, we don't need to make nice to be friends and to respect each other's work. So that's where I would go.
Yeah. Now, can we confirm the date of that, Hoffmann? Are you sure it's 2012?
That's what I have is his...
That sounds right to me, but... I just wanted to make sure of that because my book came out in 2014. So he had not read it and did not know any of the arguments in it by that point.
He does cite your Lulu publication.
Yes, which does not argue against the historicity of Jesus. So I think Hoffmann was going insane by the time he wrote that, where he was saying things about my work that was not in my work at the time.
Okay.
Like not the Impossible Faith doesn't even, so there are a lot of other things that are really weird going on with Hoffmann at that point. But he's talking about not the Impossible Faith, which does not argue against the historicity of Jesus at all. It's only against the historicity of the resurrection. So it seems evident that he just wrote this screed, not even having read the book, doesn't even know what its arguments are. And so it's just being pointlessly polemical, which I thought was weird at the time when that came out. There isn't really much to respond to it because it's not responding to my book, which had all of the refutations of that position. In fact, I wrote on the historicity of Jesus in part as an answer to arguments like Hoffmann's in there. So that's the oddity of the Hoffmann piece that I find very strange. But there is one kernel of like a valid or at least a sensible argument in there, like that it's not merely pointlessly polemical. I mean, it's also worth pointing out that Hoffmann seems to be confusing me with the legitimately crank conspiracy theory stuff, because my theory doesn't involve any conspiracy theory. It relies on no assumptions that aren't already mainstream about that, like that the Christians were the mainstream sect that controlled document production, did get rid of or prevent the preservation of a lot of alternative views of Christianity. And that's just a mainstream fact. We know there's no conspiracy was involved in that. It's just that's how they controlled and decided the preservation of documents. But with Hoffmann, he says the one thing about it just looks like there's a historical guy in there, right? Like the Gospels have Jesus. He doesn't give specifics, but there's things like his siblings have names and he comes from an obscure town and like all of these things that are supposedly historical about Jesus. But if you pick any mythical person, Osiris, Romulus, Dionysus, Moses, they all have the same things written about them. They have named siblings, they have weird towns they come from, and so on. Okay. So that's where I think that's not a valid argument, but it's at least I understand where he's coming from on that.
But here's where I do very much agree with him. And I think it's also fair to say about your more recent work. I think you've come into a children's playground with a power saw and you've chopped down all of the toys and you then turn around and give them Tinker Toys to play with. Uh-huh. That it's much more destructive than constructive. And so give me a chance now to give an alternative argument. And then we can come back and see, what the questions might be from Derek and others. As you know, I'm a big believer in Q. And the Q document is extremely important, if there were a Q document, because it rivals in time to the authentic Pauline epistles. But it's difficult to date some of this stuff. But it certainly is independent. In the Q document, Jesus clearly is nothing more than a mortal who is selected at his baptism to be God's agent, primarily to be a new Moses, to change Jewish law to make it more compassionate. So his primary opponents are not Gnostics, they're not Judaizers, they are simply Pharisees who load up law on the burdens of people and make life unbearable. There's nothing in the Q document to suggest that there was a revelatory revelation of anybody about Jesus as pre-existent. He actually he's compared to Moses, to Ezekiel, and to Isaiah, all of whom he and his readers would have assumed were historical characters. So it's one mortal character over another, having to do with the legitimacy of Jewish law. It's not about salvation from heaven, that people in believing in Jesus then can be saved. It has to do with you tithe the mint and the cumin, but you leave aside love and justice. So that, in my view, is the earliest manifestation of what we have as Christology. And there's not even a cross and a resurrection, although there is a cross. Jesus says, bear your cross and follow me. So it's an assumption that his attitude toward the law got him killed. Now I would go back to Paul. Paul has the same problem. He's got an interpretation of the law that Christ is the end of the law, primarily in the death of Jesus. And he has no obligation to say anything about the historical Jesus for his theology, except that he was crucified, which certainly is something that happens to mortals. And so there again, his concern is he certainly mythologizes so that it's faith in Jesus and his resurrection that gives salvation. But there again, the primary concern is this human being giving a different interpretation of law. Now, you said that there are no external evidences that you would consider related to Jesus. And you and I have gone around on this one before, but I'm going to insist that Josephus does talk about Jesus, not in Antiquities 18, but in Antiquities 20, with respect to whom he calls James, the brother of Jesus, called the Christ, but he puts it in the opposite direction. The brother of Jesus called the Christ, whose name was James, as though the reader would already know who Jesus is. Now, how would he know about who Jesus is? How would the reader know? It's because the reader already read in chapter 18 something about Jesus, but certainly not the Christian interpolation we know as the Testimonium Flavianum. Now, what Josephus says is that Annas, who's the chief priest and a Sadducee, whom he says is the most cruel of the Sadducees, the most cruel sect of the Jews, called a Sanhedrin and invited or demanded James and some others, we don't know how many, but presumably co-religionists, to the Sanhedrin and brought charges of violation of the law and had them stoned. Then he said, then Josephus says, but some, and by the way, I think this is usually badly interpreted in the Greek, but there were some who were more tolerant about the law and exacting about the law, who objected to their execution and wrote to the king, the Basileus, that Annas should not persecute people like that any longer. Now, it seems clear that James and these other co-religionists had changed Jewish law such that Annas had justification in the Sanhedrin for getting rid of them. But other more tolerant interpreters of the law thought that they were innocent. You say have that same ambiguity about the status of Mosaic law in the Q document. So my argument from Q is that it represents the earliest manifestation of Jesus's commitments. It's actually a Jewish document, not a Christian one. Jesus is not a Messiah. There's no faith in Jesus because of he's the heavenly revealer or the Son of God. That the concerns that he has, the author has, is about Jesus as the new Moses in changing Jewish law. That's how Paul understands the significance of Jesus as well, at least in part. And the reference in Josephus indicates that James and some of the others had the Jewish law had an ambiguous status for them, so that some Jews can consider them violators and some could consider them tolerable. So that's the first argument. The second argument I want to make has to do with Mark and mimicists. I agree with you entirely on this point, but with an important caveat. Namely, I think Mark has so heavily mythologized Jesus that are hardly any historically reliable information left in Mark that he couldn't have received from the Q document, which I think he knew. So I think Mark is relatively useless in establishing historical information. I also think you're right that the gospel tradition, including the Gospel of John, is heavily indebted to Mark's narrative. So that we do have a kind, from our perspective, a historically corrupted, mythologized Jesus in the gospel tradition at a very early stage. And by the way, at the canonical level, the Q document never achieved that status. But what is fascinating to me is that you almost need a historical Jesus to make the mythologizing of Jesus make sense. That's why the subtitle of mythologizing Jesus is From Jewish Teacher to Epic Hero, because Mark is saying that Jesus is superior to Hector and Odysseus in particular. Both of them did not have divine parents. In both cases, they're mortal. In both cases, they die. And Mark is trying to say that Jesus is a mortal who rises. And there, Jesus is like in Q, he's a Galilean. He gets baptized by John the Baptist. He's identified as the Son of God. God works through him, and he dies, and God vindicates him. The final thing that I want to mention, and I'll give you plenty of chance to come back at this, is the Johannine tradition. And I consider Papias in the Johannine tradition. And I know that you're going to view these references with more skepticism than I. And so that's something that we can talk about. But just to be as precise as I can, I'm going to read a couple very short passages. And of course, these are ones you know well. So I'm not trying to school you in this. Yeah. Right. I'm trying to school the viewer.
Yeah.
The only trustworthy claim from any early Christian author to have known Jesus personally appears at the beginning of 1 John, where the elder identifies himself among multiple eyewitnesses. Quote, what was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have observed and our hands have handled with regard to the logos of life. And the life was made manifest, and we have seen, give witness, and proclaim to you as the eternal life that was with the Father and was revealed to us. What we have seen and heard, we also announce to you. But then Papias, who knows, by the way, the 1 John and others. If someone ever who had followed the elders should come by, I would investigate the sayings of the elders, what Andrew or Peter said, or Philip, Thomas, James, John, Matthew, or any of the other Lord's disciples had said, or what Aristian and the elder John, disciples of the Lord, are saying in the present tense. For I did not consider things derived from books to benefit me as much as things derived from a living and surviving voice. Because most of the exposition of Papias has failed to survive, and because much of what does survive is useless with respect to the historical Jesus, modern investigations rightly ignore Papias. That's fair enough. Even so, the beginnings of 1 John in the exposition provide valuable evidence that Jesus existed and surrounded himself with admirers who are named. The dogmatic dismissal of Jesus as a mythical fabrication should take seriously such early attempts in the Johannine tradition to transmit faithfully lore about the historical Jewish teacher. To be sure, from its inception, the fourth gospel mythologized Jesus to rival Dionysus. Nevertheless, it affirmed that the Logos became flesh and pitched tent among us, and we observed his glory. Though mythologized, Jesus was not a myth. So that would be the substance of my response. The most important part of it, though, Richard, and the one where I think you can join company with the likes of Mark Goodacre, is my reliance on the Q document, which is a hypothetical reconstruction. But I would consider that far more valuable information about Jesus than what you attribute to Paul.
Okay. Yeah, so that's roughly 3 points in and of itself. So to go back to the beginning of that, which is the idea that, say John, for example, is mythologizing Jesus as a new Dionysus. Even your reconstructed Q document. Now, like I said, I find this highly speculative and not secure, right? I don't think we can claim to know all the things that you claim to know about the Q document, like the date of it and all of this stuff. I think there are other and possibly even better explanations for the material in Matthew and Luke than that hypothesis. Which does lead me to ask one simple question, though. If we were able to prove somehow some new evidence came to light that established that there was no Q document, that it was just Matthew expanding on Mark and just Luke revising Matthew, if we conclusively proved that would seem to remove almost all the evidence that you lean on for the historicity of Jesus. Would that be an accurate characterization, that you're really depending on Q?
No, I don't think so. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm willing to abandon Q, of course, and you know that. Because
sure, yeah.
Mark
I just want to understand the logic of your argument. Okay, yeah. I just want to understand how dependent are you on that?
Well, Mark Goodacre and I will be, in fact, debating Q with Myth Vision sometime relatively soon, so we can tune in with that. Okay, let's, for the sake of argumentation, let's say there's no Q. And let's say with the fire hypothesis that the Matthew-Luke overlaps come from Luke's knowledge of Matthew. But what Matthew surely knows is a tradition that made Jesus the alternative Moses. You have this in the Beatitudes, or the antitheses in the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard it said of old, and you have Leviticus or Deuteronomy.
You can get it out of Matthew then, yeah.
You can get most of
so we can get that out of Matthew.
You can get out of Matthew, and
I think so.
Most form critics would say that Matthew already is dependent on oral tradition, that ascribes to Jesus this alternative view of the law.
Yeah, I don't think there's any evidence of an oral tradition. I think that's more of an assumption than anything. But I agree. I agree with one thing, that I think Matthew is very much repainting Jesus as Moses, right?
Yeah.
The birth narrative, the five decalogues, the five great discourses, lots of other things he does. And I agree with your analysis. I don't agree with everything in Two Shipwrecked Gospels, but the one part that I do agree with is finding all of the ways that Matthew, in my opinion, it's Matthew, is redacting, taking Deuteronomy and updating Deuteronomy and making Jesus the new Deuteronomic Moses. And I think that actually shows like the way they're using Deuteronomy as a source text to construct this story. I think
of course that is a type of mythologizing. So Jesus doesn't claim that for himself. So this itself is not a part of the historical level.
Yeah, I think that's
a part of the mythologizing level.
That's a plausible way to put it. I think that's a good way to put it, is that from your perspective, like I think but I should point out, I think historicity is plausible. I give it a 1 in 3 chance. I don't think it's like beyond belief, but I do think there are plausible theories of historicity. I just don't think they hold up ultimately with as strongly as an evidence as people think. But one plausible view is just what you said, that Jesus was a particular type of teacher, and then when they came to tell his story, they constructed into a Mosaic myth.
That's right. Yeah, that's what I would say.
But I would say it's also just as likely the other way around, that in the same way that John made Jesus into the new Dionysus, if we had a Q or if it's Matthew, either way, I think they're making Jesus out of they're creating a Jesus out of Moses, right? So they're doing the same thing. They're taking these teachings that come from the revelatory Jesus, and some of them come, I think, from apostles and stuff that are claiming they came from Jesus. But in the way that teachings of Jesus sort of evolved over time is to be more what certain communities want him to have said. But whether it's through revelations, whether it's from the original sect, wherever it comes from, they reify those teachings by putting basically in the mouth of a figure. They put him on earth, and they use Moses as the model to construct him. So I think both theories can explain this evidence the same way. They're in both ways, you're taking the teachings of Jesus and remodeling them into a mythology based on Moses. And I think that's, we can't decide between those two possibilities from the evidence that we have presently, other than the fact that that Paul doesn't seem to know of any of this.
Oh, no. I want to get to that.
But it'll come up as I think to get to that. So the general gist of that is that I think that mythologizing Jesus based on Moses is just as possible whether he existed or not. So I don't see that as evidence for his existing. It could just as easily have been the community's teachings, whether claimed or actually through revelations or what they got from scripture, because a lot of the teachings are getting from scripture. We know First Clement, for instance, believes that some of the scriptures are actually the teachings of Jesus that are being communicated to the prophets. So a lot of these teachings, I think they're cobbling together from different sources that don't necessarily come from a historical Jesus in the real sense. The point being is that this evidence can be explained on those theories.
But the document is not claiming that they receive it by revelation to Cephas, and that there was a being who was apostatized. Now, let me just say one more piece.
Well, Mark does the same thing. Right? So Mark reifies Paul's teachings. Like you can show, Dijkstra and various other authors have shown quite elaborately that Mark is taking Paul's teachings and converting them into Jesus's teachings and stories about Jesus. But there's no pre-existent Jesus there. There's no appearance narratives there. All of the cosmology that's in Paul is not in Mark. Mark is actually deliberately stripping all that out and turning it into an ordinary prophetic allegory, basically an ordinary myth. I think Matthew's doing the same thing with Jesus. I think they're deliberately leaving out the pre-existent Jesus, even though the earliest creeds we see from Paul, they believe that Jesus was a descending archangel who assumed a body and merely appeared to be like a human and then was killed and then resurrected and so on and ascended to heaven. We have 1 Corinthians 15. He says the first time Jesus gets seen is the resurrected Jesus gets seen by Cephas or Cephas. And that it's the atoning death that was confirmed that way, and so on. Paul talks about this in Galatians 1.
But it's not denying that he was a human being before that and had a different attitude.
It doesn't deny it. Well, but it's not there is the point. That's what I'm saying. It's not there. So we can't assume, we can't tell the difference, is what I'm saying, between whether the Q document or Matthew's Moses myth comes from reifying the same way Mark's myth is constructed? Does it come from reifying teachings, or does it come from an actual teacher or an actual memories of a teacher? Okay. We don't have any evidence to tell those two things apart, and that's the conundrum that we're in.
Well, I still don't think we are without evidence. So, for example, here is information in Paul that is attributed to is about Jesus that appears in my reconstruction of Q, and in fact, 3 of these appear in all reconstructions of Q. Jesus' mission was limited to Israel. Jesus prohibited divorce. Missionaries should live by the gospel. Jesus had 12 followers, devoted followers, and Jesus will return to reward the faithful. But in addition, we have about a dozen overlapping sayings. Almost all of they all appear in my Q. Most of them appear in other reconstructions of Q. Even though they're not attributed to Jesus, they represent something similar. But the one piece that we haven't mentioned that I think is huge is the kingdom of God. And it occurs 19 times in my reconstruction of Q. It occurs 7 times in Paul, usually in the context of the kingdom of God as a future thing. People are not worthy to enter the kingdom of God. But in one case, it seems to be that the kingdom of God offers an alternative ethical project from those that he's writing. This is in Romans 7, I believe. Mm-hmm. And so it's not as if we don't have what I would call Paul Q symbiosis. I think they're sharing traditions, some of them articulated as being related to Jesus, most of them not, I would grant that. And some have argued that the direction of dependence actually goes from Paul into the gospel tradition. Dijkstra would be an example.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how forced that feels to me. As someone who's worked with these texts for about 40 years. So not that I'm going to persuade you, Richard, my friend, but it really feels so forced to me and unnecessary. And this is from someone who's a friend, who's also a mythicist in a way, who also is an atheist. I'm not trying to defend Christian orthodoxy. I'm trying to understand, as you are, the historical roots of the fascinating mythologies and grew up around Jesus. Just one final note. I am really becoming fascinated with what's sometimes called fan labor or fan fiction. And this happens both with fictional characters, which is what you would probably prefer, but it also happens with historical characters like Kobe Bryant or whatever. And so the question about whether if the fan is a fan of a historical person or a made-up person like Madonna or whomever, there are mythologies and projects and creativity that emerge out of this. You know, you have fan fiction for Gandalf, for pity's sakes. You know, you have fan fiction for Elvis, well, and I don't know anybody who denies Elvis. So
Enoch is fan fiction on Genesis, right?
So no, you have it
right?
in
so like
All I'm saying is this is something we actually can observe in our own culture about how impressive people and mythological characters take on mythological lives of their own. And I think much of what I'm doing in mythologizing Jesus and the Dionysian gospel is identifying the way that you have early Christian fan fiction saying myths not because they're trying to prove that Jesus existed, but rather they're trying to expand and explore the various ways that Jesus is important. In other words, it's evangelistic in a way for them. But I can imagine from your perspective, there's a sense in which this fan fiction is trying to prove the historicity of a character. To prove that it's fictional. That's what I got it backwards. So fan fiction can either be of real heroes or fabricated heroes.
Yeah, this is a point I make on the historicity of Jesus, that the mere fact that Jesus gets mythologized is not evidence that he didn't exist. The significance is that he's so tremendously mythologized that you need independent evidence, independent of the mythology, to establish his historicity, and that's where we come up short. I
don't think we do. No, your argument is right, but I think there's evidence.
Well, you would say Josephus, right? So you think that even that, I think there's a number of problems with the Josephus argument. Because even there, your version of your interpretation of events in the Josephus passage is compatible with the non-existence of Jesus, which is a point that I've made before. Because Paul understands all baptized Christians to be brothers of the Lord, he elaborately discusses why that is, and it's fundamental to the salvation scheme in Christianity. When Josephus cites James as a brother of Jesus, or he says brother of Christ, or brother of Jesus Christ, the brother of Jesus named Christ.
That's right.
That could be Josephus not understanding that brother of the Lord means cultic brother, not biological brother.
But right? Why assume that he's...
And then you can have all the rest of the narrative be the same. I think you've got the interpretation of that passage wrong as well. But I think even if we granted all of that, we can't establish from Josephus that there actually was that he was a biological brother of an actual Jesus rather than the spiritual brother of the deity that he worships, or the demigod.
But then he should have said that the others are brothers of Jesus too, because they're...
Well, that's the thing though. It's like he wouldn't say that if they're not necessarily, I guess he could say, right? Like if he was going to do, if the brother of the Jesus and some others, but he just says, and some others, which is vague. That can reference other brothers of Jesus, but that's assuming that Josephus understands what brother of the Lord means, which I'm saying that he probably wouldn't. He would hear that he's the brother of the Lord and assume that meant biologically the brother of Jesus, and not know that that's actually a cultic reference to any baptized Christian. So, but I don't think that's actually what's going on in that passage. I think actually Josephus is referring to Jesus Bamnamnius. I think that the of Christ part, the so-called Christ part, was inserted later. I don't think that's in there originally. Origen couldn't find it in the original Josephus.
No, I agree with you. I think it's an interpolation too. At that point, as also in the other text.
That's a whole side debate as to what happened there.
Okay. All right. Derek, you got something to say?
No, go ahead. I didn't catch what you said there.
Oh, go ahead and repeat that last phrase there, Dennis, for Dr. Carrier.
No, I'm not sure what I said, actually. So
okay, that's all right.
I think it was just kind of a wave on the topic, I guess, to the next idea, because you guys definitely agree to disagree on Josephus at this moment. Watching your first debate, I took a few notes. I didn't have too many, but it seems like what Dr. Carrier and what you have in difference is Q is obviously vital, as everyone can see in your reconstruction of the gospel Q. And Dr. Carrier starts with Paul being the most primitive information we can have pertaining to the movement and the figure Jesus Christ, or Jesus, the so-called Christ, and his movement, Cephas and others such as James and so forth. What we see is oftentimes I see, such as your theory, Dr. Carrier, is people will use Paul and say, hey, Paul doesn't talk about a ministry on earth. He doesn't talk about people, demons being cast out, a miracle working Jesus with his ministry. And this seems to be the strongest evidence. It's kind of an argument from silence. Like, wouldn't he say something if this were the case, or if this guy did any of this stuff? And he doesn't. But in the debate, you mentioned, Dr. MacDonald, paranesis between Q document and Paul's writing. For argument's sake, suppose Q exists. Is there a literary... Does Paul know Q? That's my question. Do you think Paul knows Q, Dr. MacDonald?
No, I don't. Although several serious scholars have thought he must have, especially because of the business of sending out the disciples 2 by 2 in a mission, and they should live by the gospel and so on. No, I don't think so. I think that there are major differences in terms of time. I think to make Q available by the time of some of Paul's early writings is way too early, because the author seems to anticipate the Jewish war coming up quickly. So I think it's more like just before the war, which is when James, the brother of the Lord, was killed with others. So I think the dating is problematic. And I don't think you need to have a literary connection to explain shared tradition.
Okay. Thank you for that answer. Dr. Carrier, would you like to comment on that? And then maybe I'll follow up with another question.
Yeah, actually, I can tie in something, an unfinished thread that we left hanging earlier about Dijkstra and his theory being forced. To give you an example of how I think it's the other way around, you take Mark's story about Jesus and the coin, right? Pay unto Caesar what is Caesar's. So you have this whole story. This is a classic example of how people were in schools at that time were taught to invent stories like this, to communicate ideas like this. But when Paul's talking about paying taxes in Romans 13, he never cites Jesus. He has no knowledge that Jesus said any pithy, clever thing like this. He surely would have cited the Lord in favor of his argument that you should pay your taxes. No, he just gives a straightforward, here's why you should pay your taxes. And he tries to argue why you should do this, why you should not resist the government, and you should pay your taxes, and so on. Paul is clearly stuck with his own argumentation here. He doesn't know anything about a Jesus tradition about the pay unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Mark is taking Paul's Romans 13 and converting it into a story about Jesus and a pithy saying about a coin in order to communicate Paul's teachings. The order of evidence, I think, is very clearly from Paul to Mark inventing a story about Jesus based on Paul. Okay, and there's many other examples of that. That's just the key one. And I think Matthew's doing the same thing. Possibly Matthew as he's part of the Torah observant sect. He's anti-Pauline, if anything. I think Matthew might have traditions similar to the way Mark is using Paul. There may have been more writings or sayings or teachings of James or Peter or so on that Matthew is reifying. He's doing the same thing to their teachings that Mark did to Paul's teachings. And the key point is that we can't prove that's not happening. We have no way to tie it back.
I want to tie into a couple things. One is, Richard, your rhetoric, and the other is, which is related to how you argue, and the other is a different history of tradition about the paying of tax. Paul's clear that you should pay the tax. The statement about give to God what's God and to Caesar what's Caesar is not at all clear. And in fact, in the context of the controversy, he's putting the responsibility for that judgment back on the Pharisees. So I don't think it's a clear one, but I just think I need to call you out on something. You can't get by as a historian, in my view, by saying it could be this. There could have been writings of Peter and James and so on that are going about. Or why not think of it this way? Certainly. Or I think it could be the other way around. That's not evidence, and it's not even argument. It's speculation.
No, that's actually That's my point, actually. That's my point. You're doing the same thing, but you're just assuming it comes from Jesus, right? And so what I'm saying is that to tell the difference between these two theories, where these teachings come from, and we have a model with the taxes teaching. I think what Mark is doing is specifically he's actually building a story that responds to arguments against Paul by reifying Paul's story and having Jesus say a pithy saying about it.
Okay,
and I saying that was unknown to Paul.
Well, I put it in here, but anyway, so.
Okay. Right. All right. That would be the similar. Okay. So that would be different than your different theory on that. But so my point is that we have two competing explanations for this evidence. So what we need is evidence that favors one over the other. And we don't have that. So that's my argument, is that we have possibilities that are equally good.
No. Those are two different questions.
To tell between them,
those are two different comments. Methodologically, it's one thing to say we don't have evidence. It's another to say that we have different interpretations of evidence. And I think there is evidence in some cases where you think, well, so for example, argumentation has to do with plausibilities. And you know this, you argue these things all the time on the, and you use plausibility. So instead of—
That would count as evidence, I think. A plausibility argument would count as a use of evidence, but go on.
That's fine. But I would say that for me, evidence means an object to interpret, and that plausibility has to do with the likelihood that one interpretation has priority over another. Now, I would quite agree with you that in many cases, we don't have the evidence we would like. And evidence that Christian fundamentalists and traditionalists have used as evidence is probably mythological evidence. So we agree at that point. But we can't abandon the notion of plausibility. And I think what we need to maybe take away from this debate for all of us is that there are disagreements and there are ambiguities in the material, and we have to not be skeptical, but more analytical in weighing the probabilities of what is more compelling as an argument in various cases and which ones are less so. And I'm perfectly willing in certain cases to grant a ground to you. By the way, I'm not willing to grant ground on Josephus. I think that's, I think my reading is the correct one.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, go ahead. Okay. I might bring that up then.
But I think that we need to distinguish between what we would consider evidence and what we would consider probabilities.
Okay. Yeah, but the probabilities also have to be based on evidence, right? So you have to have some sort of evidence-based reason for assigning a different probability to one thing versus another. So like plausibility would be based on, is that plausible in context? And then your evidence would be the context. And like, that's not what someone would say or something like that. There's always some sort of evidence that is girding the probabilities, that is supporting the probability assertions. That
it's symbiotic and it is fine. We can let that go.
Okay.
Derek, did you have another thing you wanted to get in?
Well, Dr. Carrier, hold Josephus for a moment, because I'd love to hear what you guys have to say in this particular one, but I don't want to put everyone to sleep just yet, because Josephus can put some people to sleep that I know. But honestly, something that came to mind, and this isn't one of my notes. I've got notes I'd love to ask about reverse priority, but I suspect we can hold that for the Q debate, because that'll be really important between you and Dr. Goodacre. I wrote this down, so remind me, the crucifixion being multiply attested. Okay, so just keep that in mind. But something I wanted to this is my own journey. And as I've been studying scholarship, coming from someone who's obviously amateur at this, and I'm looking to you guys to learn the information. I told this to Dr. Price, for example. I said, Dr. Price, I wonder if some of the evidence that you're kind of putting to the side, you're maybe too critical of, like you're not allowing it to potentially be evidence for. He goes, that's possible. It's very likely I could be hypercritical on some things. I mean, he is a Dutch radical for crying out loud, But no, I'm just making my point. And I said, one of the things that I thought was interesting, and maybe I'll get your thoughts first, Dr. Carrier, and then Dr. MacDonald, because this kind of goes into the vein of the mythologizing. In the mythologizing between the development of the synoptic gospels all the way to the Johannine gospel, I've heard from people like Ian Mills, upcoming PhD candidate, Mark Goodacre, other critical thinkers. They've said, well, it seems like an earlier tradition in Mark has Jesus claiming he's going to do certain things, and it flops. It doesn't happen. So later gospels are patching up these things, which seem more human in nature, almost like Jesus said, I will tear down this temple and rebuild it. And then later on in John, well, he was talking about his body, guys, the rebuilding of the temple was spiritual, not literal, or it's referring to Jesus's resurrection. And historicists use this kind of idea that there's a development from like a possible actual tradition of a man who said something was going to happen, or he was going to do something or whatnot. And it failed. Like he actually is a failed apocalyptic preacher. And so they spiritualize it, cognitive dissonance, as believers in the sect, saying, well, he obviously is true. We aren't going to let that go, just like they wouldn't let Yahweh go. And they continue to believe this man even after he died. This also touched into Paul. So I guess my question would be focused on that. Like, how do you deal with that kind of evidence? Have you heard of any evidence that makes you kind of question that and say, you know what, that's possible evidence for historicity, Dr. Carrier? And then we can ask a question about Paul after we're done with this, with you both responding to that idea.
No, because that actually comes from Mark, not John. I mean, John does do the thing that you're talking about, but I will tear this down and rebuild it in 3 days. That's a line in Mark. So Jesus actually, and we know this actually from Paul, is talking about the building from God, which is we're going to inhabit our new bodies that are waiting for us in heaven. So that is a reference to the resurrection. So it's clear that there was some saying that's conveying Pauline doctrine about the resurrection, that he's going to tear down the whole system of Judaism and then rise again with basically create a new Israel through his resurrected self. And so that actually goes back to either a revelatory or an actual Jesus. Again, I think it's a revelatory Jesus. Paul seems to think so. And then that, of course, gets reified into the whole, I'm going to tear down this temple. And then that was misunderstood. And then John has a story where those were false, or was it Luke, I think, has it false accusers that he was going to tear down the temple. Then John comes along and says, oh, he was secretly always talking about his resurrection. But when John gives that exposition of Jesus' saying, that's actually a correct exposition of the original intent of the saying as you find it in Mark. So I don't think there's anything going on here in terms of historicity. I do think what we're seeing here is an actual saying tradition that is being interpreted or responded to in different ways and represented in different ways in the mythology. So the debate between me and Dennis would be, does that saying go back to an actual Jesus, or does it go back to the revelatory Jesus that Paul constantly is talking to? And not Paul alone, others were talking to a revelatory Jesus as well. Or is it a made up tradition? But like, we don't know, we don't have evidence to really answer this because we can't interrogate anyone who was there to say, where did the saying come from?
Using the temple, let me ask you this and that, and then I'll hand it off to you to answer this too, because I think maybe that example is a bad one. But the kingdom of God, like you mentioned earlier, Dr. MacDonald, I've heard that there is an earlier understanding for the kingdom of God that maybe even early primitive Christians believed in an actual Jewish kingdom that was supposed to come. And then it gets like a Platonic spin on it, or because it didn't actually come in the physical sense, they spiritualized the kingdom. And now Luke's saying, hey, the kingdom's in you. What do you mean? I thought this thing was something God was really going to bring. Now it's not actually coming. So because it's a failed prophecy, possibly stemming from a real Jewish preacher who's saying, the kingdom of God's coming, blah, 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 blah. Like he's getting ready, kind of like the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarian sect think, like it's coming. The angels of God are probably going to come help us knock out the enemies of God and such. That the development even of the term, the kingdom of God, takes on a new spin in later Christian tradition. Does that make sense? Like, was there a primitive kingdom of God, maybe stemming from a Jewish teacher? And of course, I know you don't agree with that. Like, there's probably other ways you would describe this, but does the kingdom of God give any development, maybe an idea of a primitive version of it? And then maybe Dennis can tackle that as well. I don't know if there's something there.
I mean, my answer would be the same. I think if that were true, it would come from the revelatory Jesus, or the original finding of messages in Scripture of the original Christians. But I'd like to hear Dennis's take on it.
Okay.
Well, I think there's a development of the kingdom of God and an inconsistency already in the Q document. And that is, in some cases, the Q Jesus talks about the kingdom of God as something that is coming in the future with the return of the Son of Man. But he can also speak of it in terms of people entering the kingdom of God as though it's present. So, for example, the Pharisees put burdens on people and don't go into the kingdom of God and prohibit others who would come into it. He also says that those who obey at the least of these commandments in the kingdom of God will be called great. But there are some in the kingdom of God who won't obey them all, and they'll be called the least. And those presumably have to do with mortals who are already identifying with Jesus's message of the kingdom of God. The most important passage, unfortunately, has been corrupted both by Matthew and Luke, who differ with each other, but it goes something like this. The law and the prophets were until John. After that, the kingdom of God is in force. Give another example. Nobody born of women is greater than John, yet the least in the kingdom of God is greater than he. So that even John isn't in the kingdom of God, and even the least in the kingdom of God is greater than even Moses and the prophets. And I take those seriously. Also in the Q document, you have two parables that say the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed that grows into a tree that gives protection to birds, or it's like yeast in dough that rises. That is, it's present in the world now, but if you have patience and wisdom, you can see that it's going to grow into something. Now, because of the ambiguity of this in Q, those who are dependent on Q, namely the synoptic authors, move the kingdom of God around to emphasize either its apocalypticism or its alternative ethic, and so on. But I want to raise another concern. You have not heard Richard or me say very much about theology. For me, theology is a long four-letter word. I try to avoid the word theology. I feel more comfortable with ideology, but I even feel more comfortable with social identity markers. That is, when people gave theological affirmations about Jesus or about God or about the Holy Spirit, they're really giving indications of what's going on for themselves and for their communities. And the ideology needs to be assessed in terms of the social identity. I actually thought in this debate to go into the various social identities that we have articulated in early Christian texts. And by the way, this is a place where Richard and I'm sure, would agree. That is, we have multiple social identities caused by whether something's written before or after the Jewish war, or is it before or after an expectation that Jesus would return as the Son of Man, or is it related to a Gentile mission or an exclusively Jewish mission? And I think one of the new tasks of the New Testament scholarship going forward is to, if you will, de-theologize theology and replace it with a more sophisticated understanding of social identity, and to understand the relationship of ideology and identity. And the reason I say that, Derek, is I actually think it goes to this business about why certain sayings get transformed. I won't go into my own interpretation of the temple word, the temple destruction word, but you can see this very clearly about whether the message of Jesus is to go to Gentiles or not. Is it to go to Samaritans or not? Is it for how Greek is it to be, and so on. So actually, I'd be interested in both of you responding to this urgency, I think, to be able to demythologize theology into social identity categories, and to see how that plays itself out in the history of these texts.
I can't add to that, Dr. Carrier, but I can say, Dr. MacDonald, that earlier we did a recording that kind of gets into this vein, because Matthew does a radically different thing than Mark. And so, yes, the social identity structure and trying to do what you're talking about here, I think it is a valuable thing. I don't know, based on if we're going to be critical and using Dr. Carrier's approach here, I don't know if it's going to tell us exactly what the most primitive Christian said.
No, it may not.
Yes, sir. But it's interesting. I think it's important to have this discussion and to maybe do follow-up show down the road on this particular topic. Dr. Carrier?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think theology very definitely, shall we say, represents more mundane things going on, but not overtly. So understanding the theology, it's not like the way fundamentalists think it is like theology is trying to figure out what's actually true. There's some sort of cosmic theological truth that they're trying to figure out. No, really what they're trying to do is they're trying to sell or market certain ideas or beliefs in the mundane real world, and about maybe even about the mundane real world. And the theology has to map onto that as a means of structurally communicating it and promoting it. Now I agree that's some of the most useful things that I think biblical scholars could do is try to find that social construct of what is socially, culturally behind these theological differences. That's awesome stuff. I do think, however, we often can't know the answer. One thing Dennis said is that my approach is destructive more than constructive. And I think that's because I think biblical scholars are attempting to claim too much, more than they can claim to know. We have crappy sources and almost none of them. All right. It's like there's so many questions we would love to know so much more about, but we just can't. And I think there needs to be some sort of evidential humility at some point to say, well, we don't really know the answers to these questions. We can propose some possibilities. Like I think Dennis has built a lot of good examples of that is a plausible explanation of that. Now, is that, like you said, does that go back? Is that primitive? Is that what really how it started? We might not know. And we might not know if Dennis's interpretation is the correct one, but I think oftentimes the way we're looking at theology, it's credible. An example I would promote to people is Bart Ehrman's book, How Jesus Became God. He has like the last chapter or the second to last chapter where he does the Nicene Creed. Like how did that monstrosity, that Frankenstein's monster come about? And he gives a very good social political explanation of how that happened. And I think that's a good example where I think he's right. We can't conclusively prove it because we don't have the minutes of the Council of Nicaea. We can't interview the people. We can't do what a journalist would do if this was a Congress, a law passed at Congress or something like that. We can do a lot more of this stuff with like the Founding Fathers and the Constitution than we can do for like the Creed of Nicene Creed. But we can do some things. We can talk about, well, there's some evidence that looks like it's going in this direction. This is why. And you can at least say that.
Let me respond. I want to be clear what I mean by social identity theory and its advantages. You gave a good example from Bart Ehrman's work, and to extrapolate from that, a lot of this social identity discourse is happening in the Guild as we speak. So it's not foreign. What is foreign is to use modern sociological methods to map onto that, how that works, who benefits from certain theological agendas. How does it stratify gender or class or race? And politics? And I think there's a lot of social mapping that can go on. So I think a lot of this concern about social identity happens in the Guild, but I think it's a bit too haphazard. And I think we could get new hermeneutical leverage on these by using a more sophisticated sociological methodology. So you're quite right to identify places where it happens in the Guild and how it can be helpful. I actually think it can even be more helpful if we replace theological language with social identity identifications.
I can give two examples. That's all I mean by that. There are two good examples. Caroline Bynum's book on the resurrection is a really good example of analyzing the competing resurrection beliefs and how they tie into political realities, like whether we're going to make women equals or not. And there's a lot of, like, she does a good job there. Who did the Crisis in Corinthians? Dale Martin. Dale Martin's work on Corinthians, the Corinthian community, is another example of analyzing the creeds and Paul's discourse about the resurrection, again, in 1 Corinthians 15, for example, and how that relates to the social realities that are going on and the conflicts between different classes and so on, that kind of inform this. There's this sort of struggle and war going on ideologically. And, if you're a fundamentalist, you see it as all talking about the metaphysics of the resurrection. But if you're like Dennis and I, we see the subtext that there's some real stuff going on here that has to do with politics and society and culture that are really informing what these debates are and why certain sides are being taken. And I think that's the kind of biblical studies I want to see more of, for sure.
I agree.
Gentlemen, something about Paul. I got to ask you, Dr. MacDonald, first. this seems to be the heart of the debates between mythicists and historicists often. And, Dr. Carrier has thrown this up in the beginning, was Paul, our earliest known source, if we go with the consensus of the 7 authentic Pauline letters, that Paul doesn't really talk about this ministry and life of this guy named Jesus on earth. Like, he doesn't really give any focus on that. And I've heard historicists say, well, he really wasn't concerned with that. The only thing he actually cared about at this point in the juncture is a resurrected Jesus, that he was a resurrected Christ at this point to Paul. So Dr. MacDonald, if you don't mind, what is your take on why Paul doesn't really, expand on this Jesus preacher, if he's a historical man? Why doesn't he take the time to talk about those things? Can you give us some background on that? I mean, the Gospels do elaborate and give in stories and mythologize him and whatnot. But is Jesus to Paul a mythologized figure at the point in which he believes in him? And maybe you can comment on Paul.
Okay, I'll give 2 very brief answers, neither one of which Richard will like. So they are these. And by the way, he's familiar with both of these answers. The first is Paul didn't write a gospel, he wrote letters. And there was no one in his congregations, as far as we know, who was denying that Jesus was a human being. What they debated was the status of the resurrection body afterwards. So he had no reason to talk about the historical Jesus. One piece that I didn't read to you that I had meant to is that Paul writes in Galatians that he spent 2 weeks with Cephas. He also met James, the Lord's brother, and he insists that he's not lying about it. Now, I'm assuming that means that they didn't just talk about fishing. They were talking about Jesus. And so Paul certainly knew more about, now, I don't think what he knew about Jesus is what we find in the Gospels, which are mythologized. But I can't imagine that he didn't know more about Jesus than he has had reason to say. So that's the first. He wrote letters. Nobody was challenging the historical Jesus. And he simply must have known more than he said. That's the first one. The second one is actually more profound, I think. Yes, he doesn't give us good historical information about Jesus for whatever reason. But we also have silence about opponents. We don't have anybody in the early church who is arguing that Jesus was not a human being, or that, so I think there's silence on both sides. I think if we didn't have Gospels, we'd simply have to flip a coin to know how much he knew. But I'm sure he knew more than he's saying. And it's not what we find in the Gospels. He knew more than he's saying. And we also don't have people objecting to the claim that Jesus was a Galilean teacher.
Yeah, I have a response to both of those. Take the latter first. I think we do actually in 2 Peter and Ignatians. I think both Ignatius and 2 Peter were written to rebut certain Christians about whom we don't get to hear. We don't get to read their texts. They're gone. Who were denying the reality of the gospel narratives, who were basically denying the historicity of them. And these were Christians, fellow Christians, that were denying it. So we know there were Christians who thought the Gospels were completely mythical, and the faction that wrote 2 Peter and the faction that wrote the Ignatian letters are against them and actually vilifying them and condemning them as heretics who should be shunned and so on. So we do know that
that's a curious argument, though, because the author, of course, is saying these aren't myths. So
Ignatius and nobody's
saying that Jesus himself is a myth. They're saying that we do not follow these myths.
The people they're arguing against, right? So 2 Peter says, how dare these people suggest that these are myths? And 2 Peter is a forgery. He says, and I was personally there and I saw Jesus and met him. This is evidence, clear evidence that there were Christians who were denying the historicity of these narratives. But we don't get to hear from them. We don't get to hear from them. And I think to go tie back to another thread we dropped is I think First John is one of these forgery texts that were built to rebut these people. I think it fits right into the tradition of 2 Peter that it's protests too much, as they might say. Like, I don't think anyone would write the first section of 1 John if there weren't other Christians who were denying that they had physically handled and met Jesus and so on. So that it affords us evidence that there were such Christians. We just don't get to hear from them directly. We only hear about them through the complaints and attacks on them by these other authors. That's the second point. And the first point, of course, I answered that. I have a whole chapter on it in Historicity of Jesus, chapter 11, where I deal with this. And I think it's mischaracterizing the mythicist position. I should say the defensible mythicist version of things. It's not the argument that anyone was denying the historicity of Jesus. It's rather that if there were a historical Jesus, there would be questions and controversies regarding his life and what he said in life and what he did in life. There would be tons of examples for Paul to draw on as for authority to authoritize his teachings and lessons and so on. There would be questions asked of him about it. There would be examples he could pull from. So there would be countless occasions for him to mention the historicity of Jesus incidentally. And out of 20,000 words, he never does. And yet he repeatedly refers to the revelatory Jesus. So why does he constantly reemphasize that the gospel and the teachings of Jesus are known by revelation and through scripture, and constantly talk about seeing Jesus in revelations and who saw Jesus through revelations and so on? He does these things repeatedly, but he never does anything comparable that puts Jesus on earth before the revelations of Jesus. So the oddity is not that we expect there to be some sort of controversy over whether Jesus existed. It's rather, if Jesus existed, this would create circumstances that would infect the letters with all kinds of references and discussions, as you would find letters about anyone else.
But, that's an unnecessary inference. And why is that not an argument from silence?
Some arguments from silence are valid, right? So if you go back to Gottschalk on this, historian who wrote Historical Method, he showed the logical structure of the argument from silence is if a silence is improbable, it's less probable than the alternative, then actually the silence is evidence for something. If you expect certain evidence to exist, if you expect the letters to mention these things, you expect there to be controversies and questions about Jesus, if you expect there to be examples, Paul to draw on examples from Jesus' life, if you expect these things and for none of them to be there, not even any, like zero, that strains against probability, right? So that it's more probable that the reason none of that enters into the letters, that 20,000 words of talking about Jesus never talks about the life of Jesus, but always talks about the celestial Jesus, the revelatory Jesus, and so on. That's perfectly what we expect. 100% that's what we'd expect if there is only a revelatory Jesus, right? So there is a differential in the probability there. Now the debate is how big is that differential? How less probable is the one than the other? That's a debate I think we can have. I think, but definitely there's a disparity.
Well, I was the one who said that the discussion in this case ought to be on probabilities, and I appreciate your dealing with that question about the probabilities of silence. Mm-hmm. But of course, 3 of your sentences in that little speech were conditional sentences. If one says that Paul knew Jesus, we would have expected this. Mm-hmm. And of course, people are going to weigh that question differently, and they're going to assess whether it's plausible or implausible. So I can tell you that Joseph Hoffmann would say that there's no necessary reason for it. This is, by the way, intended not to be an argument with you. It's to say that the issue is, in many cases, probabilities with the absence of evidence. And
correct.
People are going to weigh that non-evidence differently.
But you still have to base your position on some sort of evidence, right? So the thing is, the if-then statement, the if part is the hypothesis that you're trying to test, and the then part is the prediction that your hypothesis makes. So then you go and look at the evidence. Does the prediction that your hypothesis makes, is it fulfilled, or is it contradicted by the evidence?
That's fair enough.
And so that's where the probability comes in.
Yes.
But to assess that probability, you have to base it on other probabilities. So when someone writes 20,000 words about a figure who's an authority and about whom a great deal, so much happened that it actually launched an entire religion around it. When that happens, typically letters that are written about this person are going to mention things like that's going to come across and mention things about them. You're not going to have a case where all you get are revelatory stories, things about the revealed Jesus. Now, it's not that that's impossible. It's just that that's less likely. It's less what we expect. If we had blinders on and didn't know what kind of documents we're going to get, and we started with a particular thesis of Jesus, and then we removed the blinders and looked at the evidence, we would be really perplexed at why Paul never mentions anything about anyone seeing Jesus before his death. I'm not
perplexed. I'm not perplexed. So
I'm super
have to
perplexed.
let it go.
Yeah. And I go through item by item in chapter 11 of Historicity of Jesus as to where and why we should be perplexed. It's not what we expect. It's not impossible. It's just less likely than what would be the case. We should have a lot more discussion of the historical Jesus, at least as much as discussion of the revelatory Jesus, right? They're both equally important. There should have been just as much going on there. But anyway, that's my take on that question. I think that wraps that up.
Okay, well, let's play a hypothetical and get into Josephus for a second here. Suppose we turn the tables and we say, all right, Dr. Carey, your argument on James, the brother of the Lord, is false. Okay, let's say it's really a brother of Jesus. If that alone had stronger argument in the direction of historicity, would that alone make you go, okay, hold on, I've got to recapitulate all the things I once said, and I need to try and reshape how I view Christianity and the development of this guy? And let's get into Josephus. If you don't mind, you might have to I don't know, you might have to go first. I'm not sure. So,
okay, yeah, no, so it would depend on how we're establishing that, right? So that's the key thing is, do we have evidence? Let's, in this hypothetical, if we found good evidence that Josephus had a source that would be reliable and that he understood that source correctly and was talking about a biological brother of Jesus, if we can establish all of those things, then yeah. So ideally, we'd want a better source than Josephus on this, or a more elaborate story that's much more clear about, for example, a Testimonium Flavianum in book 18. If we had something that was way more exactly what Josephus would write about Jesus, that would be pretty good. Unless all of the information in it comes from the Gospels, then, if we could just establish that Josephus had some other source than the Gospels for his discussion, or for more than the Christian lore about the brother of the Lord, James. We would need to be able to establish that Josephus knew that he was talking about a biological brother, and that whoever the source is he's using would have known that too, right? So and we just don't have that presently. So right now we don't know if Josephus even wrote the line so-called Christ. We also don't know that he knew what brother of the Lord meant from his source, who his source was for any of this. And incidentally, this story about James completely contradicts the version of the death of James in Hegesippus, which is the only Christian source for the death of James. So there's incongruities here that would have to be overcome somehow with a better slate of evidence than we have. We just don't have that right now. Now, if we had a lost letter of Paul that we could authenticate, where he goes into when, very clearly mentions James being the biological brother of Jesus, growing up with Jesus, for example, or something like that, that would be a clincher. That would seal the deal. We would just need one good authenticated letter from Paul with one line a believable line like that is all we would need. We don't really need a whole lot of evidence. It's just the evidence is so poor, we don't have it presently.
Dr. MacDonald, would you like to comment on that? And one question I have, maybe you can answer, Dr. MacDonald, even though I should probably ask you, but I want to allow conversation on both sides, is does Josephus ever mention someone's the brother of someone and he's not talking about them actually being their literal brother? Or do you think this is I think Dr. Carey might suspect this is Christian interpolation, so therefore it's using a Christian source, so therefore it's saying a baptized Christian or something to that effect. But I don't know if Josephus ever uses a reference like someone so-and-so is a brother of them in a non-biological sense. So that just throwing it out there. But
yeah,
we get into Josephus?
I don't think Josephus would understand that at all. Or it wouldn't immediately be obvious to him that it could mean a non-biological brother. So I think Josephus's tendency to refer to brothers as actual brothers is why he would do so here, because he doesn't know about the Pauline doctrine of adoption. But anyway, that's just to clarify my point.
Okay, Dr. MacDonald, what are your problems with his criticism of the Josephus situation? And then maybe we can get a little bit into that back and forth before we wrap things up, because we could really get into so much stuff and I don't want to take up too much time. There's always a little detail or example that can be argued, but in Josephus, it seems like if there's any extra biblical documentation that we're going to really want to use as a source, Josephus seems to be one of the stronger versions of it. So would you like to elaborate on this, Dr. MacDonald?
Of course I would. Yeah. And I want to do something of a mind game with us. First of all, I would want to say that we do have an early potential reader of Josephus who, if he saw this text, took it to be the brother of Jesus. Namely, in the Acts of the Apostles, we have a reference to the death of James, the Lord's brother. And Steve Mason has argued that that is a reference to what he would have read in the Antiquities. So I know there's a big debate about that. But
the James in Acts is killed by the sword. James in Acts is killed by a king by sword,
and not by stoning. That's correct.
Yeah, and not by the Sanhedrin.
But he certainly understands it to be around.
Also,
the same
I should
time.
point out, Acts never says it's the brother of Jesus. That's a presumption that we add. None of the Jameses in Acts is identified as the brother of Jesus.
That's true.
That's important to note.
So let's go back to Josephus's story, though. And let's bracket the question of the brother of Jesus. And by the way, first of all, for this, Josephus doesn't need a source. In this part of what he's writing in the Antiquities, he's in Jerusalem. So he can be an eyewitness and a reporter without having a source in front of him.
Oh, that would be good too. Yeah, like if Josephus said, I saw this, right? That would be an important. If we had that would be great.
He doesn't say that. He doesn't say that.
Right. Unfortunately.
But he doesn't say that with most of what he's writing in Book 22. 20.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's unfortunate and annoying, but yeah.
But this much is clear. From Josephus's perspective, a cruel Sadducee chief priest had stoned somebody and some others. And those who had a different view of Torah that was more tolerant and more precise faulted Ananus for doing so and complained that to make him desist from doing it again. And I think implied is to make sure that you don't kill other Christians who would have the same nuanced understanding of Torah. Now, that's the case whether or not you think James is the brother of Jesus or not. The thing that I find fascinating is usually when you have a new character introduced in narrative, you present the name first and then the biological association. So, so-and-so, the wife of so-and-so. But in this case, the use of the names is different. The brother of Jesus, and by the way, I think the Christ, called the Christ, is a secondary Christian interpolation. You also have it in chapter 18 in the Testimonium Flavianum. And then you have James by name. Now the reader presumably knows who this Jesus is better than James, because James now is going to get associated with someone that the reader knows. Now here's where I'm sure Richard would want to go with this. There are 9 characters in Josephus that are named Jesus. And so the reader by book 20 would have been exposed to lots of Jesuses, right? So if you move away from this idea of the Christ, then you have a reason to say, which Jesus is the reader likely to know. But then I'd want to know, what other Jesus do we know of that had a brother named James or Jacobus? And why would there be a kind of following of that person who similarly is violating Jewish law to the extent that the strict Sadducee would have him expelled? So this is a case, again, I think, of historical probabilities. I wouldn't want to say that Richard has no validity in his interpretation of Josephus. From my perspective, it seems forced and unnatural. And so I think maybe we could leave it at that unless Richard wants to come back, or you, Derek.
No, I actually, I want to comment on that. Well, first of all, Josephus doesn't always give the biological or the patronymic the first time he names someone. I've gone rounds with this with Tim O'Neill on this before. Josephus does sometimes name someone and then give the biological relationship later. And in here, there's a Jesus 3 sentences later that actually seems more likely the Jesus that is meant, Jesus ben Damnius. This is a story. So this story appears in a context of a sequence of successions of priesthood. So Josephus is explaining how the priesthood succeeded from one priest to a high priest to another, and how conflicts resulted in build up to the war with Rome. So when we get to here, the story ends with the next priest, high priest, Jesus ben Damnius, being appointed, and it appears being appointed in punishment for Ananus. Ananus is deposed, and he's replaced with Jesus ben Damnius. Now, we actually know that certain scribal practices, it is entirely possible that originally this passage said, James, the brother of Jesus ben Damnius. If there was an interlinear note above it that said the one called Christ, scribes might have thought that they were supposed to be transposed. One was an error and the other was a correction. We have many, many examples of this happening in the literature, and we have support in Origin for this actually having happened. So it is possible that this was how it originally was written. But even if it wasn't that, even if you just took so-called Christ out of there, what you have is Josephus saying there's James, or the brother of Jesus, whose name was James, were killed, etc. And then 3 sentences later, and then Ananus is deposed and replaced with Jesus ben Damnius. So a reader could easily infer that this has been about Jesus ben Damnius. His brother James got killed by Ananus. Ananus was punished by being removed for it and replaced by the brother of the man he killed, and which would be a typical way for a social system to sort of smooth over feathers, as it were, right? To reward someone in compensation for a crime against them, to prevent feuds, family feuds. And in fact, the next passage, we have more attempts by the Ananus family to gin up, favoritism, to sort of give money to sort of smooth things over to Jesus ben Damnius, which would be another example of smoothing things up. So there could be subtext here that makes total historical sense and it matches the details. But that's not the key thing here. The key thing here is that when Dennis gave a description of this passage, I don't think it's accurate. And I want to read the passage so we know what we're talking about here. And the key part starts with, report goes that this eldest Ananus proved the most fortunate man. Sorry, that's the wrong one. Okay, but this younger Ananus, who, as we have told you already, notice Josephus specifically tells us he's talked about this before, took the high priesthood. He was a bold man in his temper and very insolent. He was also of the sect of Sadducees, who were very rigid in judging others above all the rest of the laws, as we have already observed. So twice now, Josephus has told us he's talked about these things before. Notice he does not have one of these back references when he talks about Jesus Christ, which means that there probably was not a back reference there. If there was, he would have said, as I told you before, right? So there would be a discussion of this, but he doesn't. When therefore Ananus was of this disposition, he thought he had now a proper opportunity. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, not changers of the law, mind you, just breakers, they're just regular outlaws, he delivered them to be stoned. Notice they're not described as Christians. There's no mention here of why they're being killed. There's no mention of what their crimes were. But as for those who seemed the most equitable of the citizens, and such as were the most uneasy at the breach of the laws, they disliked what was done. They also sent to the king, desiring him to send to Ananus that he should act so no more, for that what he had already done was not to be justified. Nay, some of them went also to meet Albinus as he was upon his journey from Alexandria, and informed him that it was not lawful for Ananus to assemble a Sanhedrin without his consent. So their concern was not that Ananus killed these people. Their concern was that he procedurally assembled a Sanhedrin without consent. So they actually don't really care about James and this other guy. Like the people who are interfering here think Ananus just assembled a court and prosecuted some people unlawfully.
I can't tell you how much I disagree with that reading.
Okay. It's what it says. And even if you look at the Greek, I don't think it changes much.
Why is it that Josephus goes out of his way to contrast the view of the law by Sadducees and Ananus and the view of the law of some in the city who are more accurate with respect to the law and more tolerant? They're going to use the illegal meeting of the Sanhedrin as the excuse for getting rid of him. It's a procedural thing. But Josephus is making and by the way, he uses very unusual vocabulary for this. He's quite clear about what he's trying to accomplish. You're right, by the way, it's not the changing of the law, it's the violation of the law. Paranomasesis, something like that. Yeah. But the word that's used for cruel is omi, which is very unusual and harsh. So I think the primary conflict is between the Sadducees who are harsh and those in the city who are generous. Now, I do think that you're right, that they've objected to an illegal calling of the Sanhedrin. So here I think we have two motivations, one having to do with the different understanding of law. So it means in my reading that James and these others have an interpretation of law which for people who are generous is tolerable. And those of whom are sticklers and especially are protective of the temple, like the chief priest, is intolerable. And I think what we have here is an appeal to the king to follow a more temperate understanding of Torah observance.
Yeah, now, none of that is in there. That's just not what's there. No, I don't. I just don't see that in there. What I see is Ananus is described as a particularly brutal man. Yep. And he just happens to be of the Sadducees, who are also particularly rigid. So Ananus, being a particularly brutal man, saw an opportunity to assemble the Sanhedrin illegally, had these people killed. And then all of the complaint after that, even it says, and such as were the most uneasy at the breach of the laws. The people who were uneasy with this were at the breach of the laws, not at the excessive use of the laws, right? So they're all of the accusation is about jumping the gun and assembling Sanhedrin.
No. I think you mistranslate that business about nomus acribos, that they're more accurate in interpretation and more tolerant, epicalestatorus or something like that. So let's leave it, Richard. We're going to have different readings of this text. But I think this is confirming that the followers of Jesus...
No, where we're at on that. Know why we're seeing that passage in different ways entirely.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Dr. MacDonald. You were saying something, though.
No, go ahead.
Well, look, it's obvious you guys don't see eye to eye on this. Maybe there could be a follow-up show, Dr. MacDonald, that we can discuss and get your point of view, break down the text, pull it on the screen. Love to see it. And maybe Dr. Carrier will want to take a bat at it too and say, hey, I need to come on the show and talk for 20 minutes about this passage. I would love to see that, of course, because this was like on the spot. We didn't anticipate to get into this particular discussion into depth into Josephus. I guess I'll ask this question. Are any of you convinced of the other's position?
If I were a believer, I would say to Richard, I'm praying for you.
So this was an interesting discussion. You guys definitely use different, I would say you permit different source material to help build your case as evidence for what you think proves your...
I benefit from this, actually. I like these kinds of debates because we're having like mundane like not theological debates where we're not like debating whether the Gospels are literally true or anything like that. No, we both agree how we're supposed to approach these texts, and I think we agree even in methodology. And so we're just disagreeing on what probabilities we assign to certain things. And that's exactly the kind of debates that scholars should be having about this sort of stuff. So that and so this gets all that other stuff thrown away, so it's out of the way, and so we can focus on like real debates that actually matter in terms of how we decide one way to go for these things, rather than getting constantly distracted on how dare you suggest that Jesus didn't really ride into Jerusalem on a donkey, you know, like rather than having those kinds of debates, we're having this kind of debate, which I think is productive and more scholarly and more useful, I think. Anyway, that's my take on what we've been talking about today.
Dr. MacDonald, would you like to ask a question or make a statement?
I'd like to make a statement. Derek, thanks so much for arranging this. I know it's a hassle, and I know you've got a young family to look after and so on. And you were a real gentleman. You did your homework too. You came with some good questions, and I'm sure that Richard and I benefit from this. I certainly did, and we'll be eager to see what your subscribers have to say about a debate like this.
Yeah. And Dr. Carrier.
Oh, no, I mean, that was what I said before is how I'd close it. No, this has been great and useful, and I quite liked it. So thank you. Yeah. Yeah,
I was definitely educated, and it makes me want to hypothesize the position. Meaning, for me, like, I want to explore using certain evidence. And like you talked about, Dr. Carrier, like, even if, let's say you conclude the evidence doesn't, let's just say it's not good enough for you to use and say, I'm not going to allow that to be the case because there's just too many problems with this. I will still hypothesize in my head at this moment and see what that might do. And I'm not saying I will lean on it. I'm saying I'll hypothesize and say, all right, what would that do with the evidence, and what would that support? What would that make for the conclusions on a historical Jesus? And then test out other ways too. Okay, if you take that evidence out, it's like a chess game. What will happen here if that is mythology and not history? And so I hope everyone watching is kind of doing the same thing. You know, the biggest thing I took away from this is to not be dogmatic and to continue exploring the evidence, looking for evidence. I think both these gentlemen here would love to see evidence that comes on the scene, even with your books written, Dr. Carrier, which would mean you'd have to redact some things. But you would go on record and say,
that would be the best second edition ever if we got something that changed everything. Yeah, absolutely. I can even think of some. I mean, I don't know if I've told you about the Herculaneum prospects, but we could get the history of Pliny the Elder, and it could say some things about Christianity that could actually change things. And that's sitting there under the ashes of Herculaneum. It's theoretically possible that we could get that. Usually I don't think we're going to find something as useful as the original redaction of Paul's letters, where we have all the Corinthian letters, not just the ones that were selected for us to see.
Well, I'm planning on...
That would be awesome.
I'm planning on cleaning my storage area, and I'm looking for Papias' expositions. If I find Papias' expositions, I'll let you know.
Something like that, yeah.
That would be awesome, actually. And you know, I would love to see that. And who knows, some of the evidence that you may not think is supportive of a historical Jesus just might be like the brother of the Lord. Who knows at this moment? I understand your interpretation.
Yeah, and notice in my book, I actually count it as evidence for historicity, right? People always don't look at the book, right? So I actually weigh it as evidence for historicity, which is how I come to my upper bound of 1 in 3 chance for historicity. So I'm not claiming confidence. I think 1 in 3 chance there was a Jesus. And if there was, I think some theory like Dennis's is really at the top of the level in terms of what's most likely to have happened. So I'm not even dogmatic on that, to be honest.
So you have a 1 in 3, a 33.33 chance, technically, that Jesus exists here. Roughly. Yeah. Dr. MacDonald, what is your probability on the historicity? Is it still 80-20, like you said in the original debate?
No, it's probably like 92-8 probability, but historians are not going to commit themselves to 100% certainty. So
well, we hope, but yes, right.
So I have to be open to things I don't understand, but for me the evidence is compelling that there was a historical Jesus who very early on in various ways was mythologized, so that it's very difficult to dig through the myth back to the nuggets of Jesus's experience. And I think Richard probably would agree with that. So that a lot of the origins of these things are hidden to us, and they're hidden behind well-meaning gospel authors who were trying to make Jesus speak to their own time. And that can be appreciated. By the way, I love these texts, but they don't do what Christian believers think the texts can do. And I think this discussion is kind of highlighting how difficult it is and how insecure it can be in digging through these materials to find what we would consider responsible historical nuggets.
Truly.
Yeah.
You guys are awesome. I really do appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, you guys witnessed one of the most polite debates I've ever witnessed in terms of in these discussions. And these guys totally disagree with each other when it comes to conclusions, probably on some foundations as well, like the Q document, the sayings of Jesus, the Logii. Is Papias actually a source that could be used? We know Dr. MacDonald does think so. And I know that Dr. Carrier doesn't. He thinks that this is Eusebius and possibly bad evidence. I would suspect that you can't really rely on Papias to make any real claims according to it. Now, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. You can correct me.
My position's a little more nuanced than that, but you're in the ballpark anyway. But yeah.
Okay. Both of the gentlemen are using different evidence. So I really do appreciate this. And I hope that everyone watching will go down in the description, get a book of Mythologizing Jesus, consider the Jewish teacher to epic hero, check out On the Historicity by Dr. Carrier. It's a thick book. Yeah. If you're not like a big book guy like me, this is his new book. This is actually the one you want to get because this is a lot more, I guess you'd say, Derek Lambertish. It's simple. It's not complicated, and it doesn't take you forever to read. You guys can get it in audiobook too. He has it on Audible for if you want to listen to it.
Not yet.
Not this yet. Book. On the Historicity, though.
Yeah, all my other stuff's on Audible. I still haven't recorded JFOS due to pandemic concerns, which I'm working on. I'm recording this month, so Audible will be out next year, but unfortunately it was delayed this year.
Well, I hope you read Dennis's book on the Dionysian Gospel and do a review on your blog, which everyone needs to go get a hold of that as well, because I really fell in love with that book. The Dionysian Gospel just made me, I didn't know that much about Dionysus till I read this, and I was like, whoa, okay, so this is just amazing. I really hope you guys help these two gentlemen out by buying the materials and contributing in some way to get this information out there, even by sharing this video, liking this video, getting others aware of who Dr. Dennis MacDonald is, because both of you guys, the guild does not agree with you, okay? Both of you. And the guild of scholarship says, nope, we're not agreeing with these guys. These guys are on the outskirts. And I'm sorry, Myth Vision Podcast will not be silenced. We will continue to bring this material to you, even if you're not in an academic setting where they're allowing this material to be spoken of. So enough on that. You guys have anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, Richard, stay warm. Okay.
Thank you. I will. Thank you.
And don't forget, we are Myth Vision.